Hey, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm gonna make some new zero clearance throat plates for my table saw and my miter saw. Check it out. So if you don't know what a throat plate is this piece that comes provided by the manufacturer. So what we're gonna be doing is creating a couple zero clearance throat plates. What that means is that there will be zero gap or clearance on each side of the saw blade. What this does is it reduces any sort of tear out on the bottom of the project when you're sliding it through the table saw. Makes it so that you have a lot cleaner cuts, more precise cuts, and less to clean up later. So to start, I took off the throat plate from my miter saw. This is super easy, it's just a couple screws to unscrew it. And then I cut down some MDF on the table saw just to the rough dimensions of all three of my throat plates. The throat plates for the table saw are gonna be about a 1/2 inch thick, and the throat plate for the miter saw is about 1/4 inch thick. So I needed to get the thickness correct for the piece that will be used as a throat plate for my miter saw. This was super easy. MDF is really soft and my planer just chewed it up in just a couple passes. And then I checked the thickness with my digital caliper and made sure it was the same thickness of the original throat plate. Hey, so you're probably wondering why I used MDF instead of a nicer wood. Really, the reason I did that is because MDF is really flat and very stable when it comes to temperature changes and changes in moisture within your shop. Here in Utah, we've got a lot of temperature changes and winter's coming up. I want to make sure that I have a very stable wood when it comes to these throat plates in both of my saws. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't use it because it's not very good looking. You can definitely use something different depending on where you live. And I also had a bunch of MDF left over after my router table build, so I just decided to use some of the pieces that would fit perfectly. Next, I removed the throat plate from my table saw. For my table saw, I'm gonna be creating two different throat plates, one for the standard saw blade and then another one for my dado stack. As you can see, my throat plate is in odd shape. Typically they're rounded at the front and the back, but mine is square, which actually makes it a little bit easier to cut these. I removed all the leveling pins and the screws from the back. And then I used some of my trusty double-sided golf tape to stick the original throat plate to the MDF to use as a template on my router. I also did the same with the throat plate for my miter saw. I then set up my router table with a templating bit, and then I began routing these things to the right dimensions. It's super nice finally having a router table with a router lift in my shop. This thing has been a long time coming. If you haven't seen that build, make sure you go check it out. It'll be tagged above as well as included in the description below. Also, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel as well as ring the notification bell. That way, you'll always know when I've got a new project that goes live with the Salt City Workshop. I've got some awesome projects coming up here in the next little while and in the next year. So make sure you're subscribed and you won't miss a thing. After I was done using the templating bit to cut everything to the correct dimensions, I peeled off the MDF from the template. Then I used the original throat plate from my miter saw as a guide to where I needed to countersink some holes for the screws to go into. This was pretty easy. I just used a Forstner bit and my drill press and made sure that the depth was correct for the head of the screw. I then peeled back the original throat plate from the MDF. I had to be pretty careful because I didn't want to break the MDF as I was peeling it back. I then installed it on my miter saw to cut the slot for the saw blade. I wanted to do this first before I add any sort of finish to this MDF, just so that it will harden up even in the slot where the saw blade goes. Once the slot was all cut, the zero clearance throat plate for my miter saw is officially done, except for the finish. So I moved on to getting everything set for my table saw throat plates, which is a little bit more involved. because I had to drill some holes and some guides, as well as get the leveling screws all set into the board. For the holes, I just marked where I needed to drill them and then took them over to my drill press and drilled them with a couple of different size Forstner bits. One of these holes really is just for convenience to stick your finger through so you can grab the throat plate. The other one has a washer and locks down the throat plate, so I have to drill it a little bit different, but everything seemed to work out perfectly, especially working with this MDF. Again, it is super soft. Now, as you'll see on the bottom of my original throat plate, there are a couple grooves. These are for the mechanisms that are connected to the riving knife as well as the saw blade. So I used a Forstner bit to cut a little bit of a pocket, otherwise the riving knife won't come up all the way. Then I used my router and a straight cut bit to cut a little bit of a pocket on the underside where the table saw blade goes. With the table saw all the way down, it won't let me put the throat plate on top of the table without this little bit of a pocket. So I routed a little bit of a pocket on the back end, and then I also needed to add a pocket on the side of that for the mechanisms that connect to the saw blade. Otherwise, the new throat plate won't allow the saw blade to be raised to the correct height. So I made a couple marks to know exactly where to cut this thing and used my router table to cut these grooves. Man, it is so nice having a router table. Next, I installed the secure washers as well as the leveling screws on each corner. I simply did this by marking where I needed to, drilling through one side so I didn't have a ton of tear out on the front side. And then I used a Forstner bit to drill for the secure washers next to the big hole that I drilled in the middle and on the back side. I then flipped the thing over and tapped a couple of holes for the leveling screws to go into, obviously screwing all the way through so that the leveling screws can push the throat plate up to being level with the table saw surface. I then added the securing washers to the back side of the throat plate and then to the middle section. Now I had to modify this a little bit because it wasn't quite right, but the modified version looks great and works just the same. I then added the leveling screws to each corner, and they went in super easy because I had pre-tapped all of the holes. It's nice with this throat plate because you can be a little bit narrower than what you need to be, and those leveling feet will bring that throat plate up to the level of your table saw. I then installed the throat plate into my table saw and then used an Allen wrench with a straight edge to make sure that those leveling feet brought that throat plate up to being level with my table saw surface. I then slid over my fence to be right on top of the throat plate but not on top of the blade. I turned on the saw and then slowly raised the blade up through the throat plate. Doing it this way is what makes it a zero clearance throat plate. Because you raise the table saw up through the throat plate, it makes it so that there is zero gap on either side of that table saw blade. And as you can see, you have a nice slot for your table saw blade to go into. Now I made a second one of these the exact same way I did before, and I did the exact same thing, just used it with a dado stack. I put the dado stack to 3/4 of an inch because I figure most dados I'll be cutting 3/4 of an inch for plywood, furniture, and different things like that. So this is what the dado stack one looks like. After all the slots were cut, I wanted to add a finish, so I used some high gloss water-based polyurethane to create a super smooth surface. I did about 4 coats of this. Now, I've never made zero clearance throat plates before, so I really have no experience on whether or not they actually help. But I am glad to tell you that with my first pass, I definitely see a difference in how much tear out there is on this little piece of plywood with my dado stack. I also installed my regular table saw blade back into the table saw. and checked out how well it cut, and it cut perfectly. There was virtually no tear out on this plywood that seems to like to chip up a lot. I then installed the throat plate back onto my miter saw and made a couple passes on that, and would you know, no tear out. I would say this project has been a success. Well, that's it for the video. Thanks again for watching. If you want to see some more shop projects, I've got a playlist queued up right here of all of my different shop projects, so make sure you go check that out. And don't forget to subscribe to the page if you haven't had the opportunity already. Thanks for sticking around to the end, and like I always say, never stop creating.